And now we look at cells. And when we look at cells, there are three areas we're going to be looking at. First is the basic structure of the cell. We'll see what the cells have inside them, what they're made up of. And then we have cell reproduction. How do these cells divide? How do one cell becomes another cell becomes another cell? And then we have cell metabolism. How does a cell receive energy? In other words, nutrients, foods that it uses to energize itself and break down that food into and resulting in energy as well. So those three things again: one, structure; two, reproduction or cell division; and third is metabolism. Before we jump into the topic, let's take a look at some of the terminology. It just helps us to get our mind structured around those words. First, we have been talking about cell, but then we talk about cell membrane. So before we ever make a cell is like a ball, and around it you have a membrane. Then you have protoplasm. Protoplasm is the liquid inside that holds everything together. What's inside that is being held together? Well, there's two segments, so I'll put another segment in the middle. And the secondary liquid is called cytoplasm. And we'll go more in detail about that. So we have cell membrane. Then we have overall what we call protoplasm. And then part of that is the cytoplasm. So protoplasm becomes cytoplasm. And inside the cytoplasm, we have what we call organelles. They're like teeny tiny organs of a cell. So we have these little organelles that are inside that are going to be doing a lot of work. Again, cells are very active and they're living, and so they do have quite a number of functions that they need to do. And so each segment is done by an organelle. Okay, so let's kind of review that. We have cell membrane right here. And then we have inside is protoplasm that we look here. And part of that protoplasm is called cytoplasm, cell liquidy. And proto, by the way, means life water. And cyto is cell. Then inside that we have organelles. And then in the center of it, which is sort of the control center of a cell, what we have is a nucleus. And inside that very nucleus, we have another form of liquid, and that is an extension of protoplasm, but it's called nucleoplasm. Okay, and then in the center of that, we have what we call the DNA. And the DNA, the extended terminology is called deoxyribonucleic acid. So these are the words: cell membrane, protoplasm, cytoplasm, organelle, nucleus, nucleoplasm, deoxyribonucleic acid, or called DNA. And that is the structure. So this is the structural aspect of the cell. Then we look at the cell division. And that division is the process called mitosis. And what happens is you have a cell and it begins to split in the middle. And the resulting two cells that we get out of that are called daughter cells. And the reason why we call them daughter cells or call them daughters, because they themselves are going to then divide and give birth, in a sense, to two more cells. Each of these is going to result in two more cells. And so the cell division continues until there's a regulation system that at some point will say, okay, enough, stop at this point. Then we look at, after our mitosis, after cell division, we shift into metabolism. Metabolism is a way of a cell that you have will receive food and will convert it into energy. So if I can put E for energy, and that's the basic concept. And then also it will formulate or structure out other components that the body may need, and it will then excrete that out, or it may develop other things that are needed within the cell, so it'll construct that. But it has two processes. One is called anabolism and the other one is called catabolism. Catabolism is when it receives the substance, and then what it does is divides it into little components. And then anabolism is when it takes those different components and restructures it and recreates what it specifically is trying to build or needs for it. So metabolism is a way for cell to then get the food, get the nutrients, get other components that it needs to either build something or to convert all that into its own use for as form of energy. So that's metabolism. So let's take an overview of what cells are. Cells are the basic unit of all living things. And so they are the active, breathing, functioning units, and those are the basic unit of all living things. Even bacteria, whether it's one single cell bacteria, to plants, to animals, to human beings, all have cells. And there are, again, a variety of different cells. And that's why we end up creating a variety of tissues. But the interesting thing about this is that the question that scientists are still pondering is that you have one egg cell from a female, and then you have a sperm from a male, and when they combine together, what they get is a one unit. And when they go this one unit that begins to divide into two, and then 2 becomes 4. At what point do each of these, while these are the same cells, at what point does one decide to become let's say a heart, another tries to become what we might call a kidney, another becomes the brain, how to draw a brain. But how do these different cells somehow start to trigger to create different parts of the body? That is a bit of a miracle, and still under study. And so that's a very interesting thing. But cells are a very basic unit of all living things that create our whole body. And without cell, life does not exist. And so what we call a life begins with these on a cellular level that divides and multiplies and creates tissues of various kinds, and then those tissues eventually become organs, and then what we see as a baby starts to form in the womb. Very, very interesting. All begins with cells. As a basic functional unit, the cell is responsible for carrying on all life processes. And so cell is a living unit that breeds, that receives food, that multiplies, reproduces. And there are trillions of cells in the human body, and they vary widely in size, shape, and purpose. So there are a variety of shapes and sizes of cells, and they're built to create different tissues, and those tissues create organs, and organs then come together to make body systems. So what is a cell? How is a cell built? What is it made out of? So the cells of all living things are composed of a substance called protoplasm. The word proto means life, and plasm basically means plasma or a water source. And so it's a protoplasm, and it's, what is it? A colorless, jelly-like substance in which food elements such as proteins, fats, carbohydrates, minerals, salts, and waters are present. And before we look into this, let us also read this. You can visualize the protoplasm of a cell as being similar to a clear gel of raw egg. So if we ignore the center of this egg and just look at the egg white, this is kind of looks like the substance that a protoplasm is, and it makes up the entire cell, a large portion of the cell. And where is that protoplasm? If you have a cell, it's like a ball, and inside is the liquid, and that creates this cell. And let's take a look at what it looks like. And so our cells, we have two types of cells. There's the animal cells, and then we have plant type of cells. And so this is a large version of what a cell would be. Again, cells are very teeny, tiny. So this is within that teeny tiny cell, there's such complexity. So we have plant cells, and the plant cells, we see that there's a cell wall. This is a hard cell wall, and it's made up of cellulose. So cellulose, cellulose, and this is what makes our lettuce crunchy, or leaves of our vegetables crunchy, is this very wall. But we're not going to take a look at the plant cells. We're more focused on the human cells, or the animal cells. And what we see is that this is a large unit, large meaning that it's a very complex unit, and it begins with what we see as a cell membrane that covers this. Inside we have an area called the nucleus. That this area is the nucleus, and in here we would have our DNA. But inside this, what we have is a protoplasm. So protoplasm is in here. That's helping to build all these what we call organelles, and there are functioning organelles in there. So just to kind of give you an overview of what these organelles do, one of the key organelle is a mitochondrion. This is our energy cell. This is what we might call our PG&E truck that goes around. These go around the whole cell and produce a lot of energy. We see that we have what we call Golgi Apparatus, and what they are is when a cell produces proteins and some kind of enzymes and creates hormones, that they are secreted into the blood through these secretory vesicles. And so and they go through these little pores. Now these pores are not just leaking leaks inside a cell membrane, but they are structured and well developed systems where stuff is sent through this cell wall outside. And so we do have our smooth endoplasmic reticulum. This one will produce fatty stuff. And again, I'm not telling you this because it's on the test or you're going to be tested on this, but just have a general knowledge of how our cells are structured. Then we have a rough endoplasmic reticulum. This creates proteins that the body might need, or other areas might need, or cell itself might need. And then we do have these what we call lysosomes. They fight any kind of infection that is within the cell. If a foreign body comes inside the cell that the cell does not like, the lysosome will come and attack it and will destroy it. And very, very interesting. Even though it's such a tiny unit, it has such complexity in it. And then our centriole right here are like what is going to be helping the cells do cell division. And that's something that we will talk about. Now just take a look at the, again, our words for the cell structure begins with the word cell. We talk about cell membrane, which is right here on the outside. Then we have protoplasm, which is on the inside. It's the liquid that's inside. And part of that protoplasm is cytoplasm. Within the cytoplasm, we have organelles. So we see that we have all these variety of organelles in here. And this is within the cytoplasm. Then we have the nucleus. So this central part right here is the nucleus, and you can see the nucleus itself has openings so that that messages can then go out from there, and that's your nucleus. And then nucleus in itself, and it has what we call a nucleoplasm. So that's part of the protoplasm. And it's the nucleoplasm that's in there. So those are our terminology words that we should know. And at the center of this, what we call our DNA, that is the message, not so much message, but the code for what either our hair is going to look like, or the particular proteins that our bodies, that the cell is going to make. And all the information of that DNA is in the center of these cells, and that is called deoxyribonucleic acid. So let's take a look at the organelle, or what are organelles? Organelles, again, we did talk about there are little organs or little structures. They're small structures or miniature organs within a cell that have their own function. We did touch on those concepts. Let's see, we have this so-called peroxisomes, and these help break down large proteins into smaller digestible proteins, and so that these proteins then can be broken down and then converted to energy for the cell. And so a number of items that happen within a cell. Again, so taking a look at this is our protoplasm. And protoplasm, part of that protoplasm becomes what? Cytoplasm. So cytoplasm has all the organelles in it. And then you have in the center of it, you have an organelle called the nucleus. Here's the nucleus. And within the nucleus, you have a a liquid called nucleoplasm. This is a protoplasm itself, but that portion is called nucleoplasm. And so again, all these variety of organelles have variety of functions. And just to talk about mitochondrion is a energy organelle within the cell. So let's take a look at protoplasm. The definition of protoplasm is a colorless jelly-like substance in cells that contains food elements such as protein, fats, carbohydrates, mineral salts, and water. And so it is a clear substance, jelly-like, and which is all around the cell. But what's floating inside is the proteins are in here. They have come through from the outside, the protein that we have eaten and to some extent the body has digested and now is coming into the cells. It could be protein, it could be fats, carbohydrate, mineral salts, and definitely water that we consume are coming in here, and the cell is going to then utilize it, and large number of those is going to be used, turned into glucose and then energy, a form of energy. And again, who's our energizers? They are the mitochondrion, and these are the systems that will do electrical currents and energize our cells. Very interesting concepts. Now, protoplasm is subdivided into two areas. One is cytoplasm. So immediately, while this whole thing is protoplasm, where the organelles are held are what we call cytoplasm. The liquid inside the protoplasm that's inside the nucleus is called nucleoplasm. And that's the liquid inside the nucleus. And cyto is liquid inside the cell. So there's two boundaries, you might say. There's the first boundary and a second boundary. The first boundary is what we call cytoplasm. That's our first boundary. Then our second boundary, protoplasm, is called nucleoplasm. And just to go over again our cell structures, if we were to draw this as an exercise for ourselves, we say, hey, what is a cell made out of? First, I will draw a large circle, and this is called the cell membrane. That's the cell membrane. Then inside here, I have protoplasm. And first part of that protoplasm, the first area of that protoplasm is called cytoplasm. Inside the cytoplasm, I have many, many different types of organelles. Then we have the nucleus, which is at the center of the cell. And the liquid inside that is called nucleoplasm. And then in center of that is our DNA. So DNA is in the center of that, and that's called deoxyribonucleic acid. And so a way to remember these terminologies is to write it down in this form. So cells, cell membrane, protoplasm, cytoplasm, organelle, nucleus, nucleoplasm, and then deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, and then draw out which comes first. And then which comes second, which comes third, and then in the series. As the book, this is the drawing that's inside our book. And so the nucleus is the center part right here. Nucleus is the dense active protoplasm found in the center of the cell. It plays an important part in the cell reproduction and metabolism. You can visualize the nucleus as a yolk of raw eggs, and that's something we kind of already touched upon, that it's a clear liquid, colorless, and it's the yolk, the white or the colorless part of the raw egg, and that's what is what we call protoplasm. And now in the center of it, we talk about reproduction. Reproduction means that there's a major part of this, that when we have our DNA, our genetic code, DNA, our genetic code, when this cell begins to divide and become two daughter cells, that the DNA is then doubled and shared, so that one half gets part of that DNA, the other gets the same type of DNA. So you duplicate the DNA, and that's where the reproduction part comes in, and that happens in the nucleus. The second aspect of this is what we call metabolism. Where metabolism happens is that we did talk about metabolism, just touched on catabolism and anabolism, and so those two things are what the cell is going to reproduce. Once it's broken down, it's the components that it gets in, like nutrients, it gets proteins, it gets in carbohydrates. Those the complex ones are broken down into little particles and then reconstructed. How are they reconstructed, or what are they reconstructed into? That information comes from the DNA, and that's where does DNA reside? It's in the nucleus. And so that's where these two words, reproduction and metabolism, are part of that. So reproduction, again, the DNA will double itself and then will divide. And metabolism is DNA gives instructions as to what kind of components, what proteins, what lipids the cell is going to produce, and that information is stored where? In the DNA. Now we look at the cell membrane. Is part of the cell that encloses the protoplasm and permits soluble substances to enter and leave. So we have cell membrane that is, again, we talked about our cell membrane that covers the cell, and this is cut in half, so we're just getting a top view of this, but the cell membrane is like the skin on our bodies. It just covers the whole, it covers the cell and protects all the organelles from leaving, and so only certain things that are permitted to come inside will come in, and then there's once the cell has produced certain proteins, certain hormones, certain lipids, and they need to be then excreted into the bloodstream, then the cell wall will allow those to exit as well. So that's your cell membrane. Cytoplasm, as we talked about, cytoplasm and is all the protoplasm of the cell except that found in the nucleus. So the first half of the protoplasm that is here, as long as we don't go inside the nucleus, all this is called cytoplasm. So it is protoplasm, but this half is called cytoplasm. Again, this will be called nucleoplasm, and let's take a look at that. But let's read this. That is the protoplasm of the cell, except that is found in the nucleus. This watery fluid contains the food material necessary for cell growth, reproduction, and self-repair. And so what's happening in the cytoplasm, we have all the proteins that the cell has ingested. How did the cell get that? Because we ate. We either eat proteins, carbohydrates, and oils, lipids, and so all that then begins to get filtered into the cell, and then cells breaks that down and utilizes that food for energy and reproducing and cell growth and repair. And so that's where the food material, it's talking about. Within the nucleus, we talk about nucleoplasm. So within the nucleus of the cell is the nucleoplasm, which is a fluid that contains proteins and a very important acid known as deoxyribonucleic acid. So this part, this is the control area right here. This is the control area of the whole cell. This is where the information is stored, and that's stored in the DNA. That's deoxyribonucleic acid, and that gives us what determines the genetic makeup, including the color of our eyes, skin, and hair. And how do we get those colors in our eyes, skin, and hair? But through the cells, because the DNA, the proteins that this will produce, and the hormones that this will produce, the way it'll send that genetic coding, the production of that will shape how our body chemistry functions. And based on that, we get certain eyes, we get certain skin, we get certain hair. And that's what DNA does. And so DNA is what designs those proteins, and all that information is stored within the nucleus area. This is the housing. And what DNA does, it combines with RNA, and RNA will then come out and give that information to the organelles of the cell to say, hey guys, I need you to make this protein, need you to make this lipid, need you to make that an enzyme, and that goes into our body and shapes our body in a very particular way.